Right. Okay, we're going to start. We've lost David, who's trying to sort them out, but we will make a start. So anyway, it's very nice to see you all and see lots of friendly faces and some new faces. It's great. And it's also very nice to see people. I can see people who have beamed in from all around Europe. I can see Italy, Belgium, France, Switzerland, and quite a few from the United States. Somebody, I won't say who, from California, I see logged in at 6 o'clock this morning. Probably got their clocks a little bit mixed up. Obviously, we've been planning one of our poetry battlefield tours this autumn, and that was not to be. But the good news is that Andy, who's here, is busy organising a poetry tour for next October. So details come out about that shortly. It'll be very nice to be back together again. Yes, if everybody could stay on mute, and just to remind the speakers as we go through it, you will unmute yourselves. You can use the chat feature to send a message, and that message will be picked up by me, David, Jonathan, and Charles. And if you want to ask a question of any of the readers, we could pick that up at the end if we have time. And I'm planning to finish about 7:45. Just to let you know, we're all recording this, and this evening we're doing something a bit different to what we've done before. In our previous readings, we sort of rather organized the content, but this time we've approached a number of very eminent experts and enthusiasts for war poetry, and we've said, then why don't you choose some poems, choose the poems you want to read, and maybe just tell us a little bit about why you chose those. And we're going to have 9 readings, and each one will do about 5 to 10 minutes each. Let me say a few sort of introductory words. Just before this, I was thinking back to a few years ago, as I was invited to by a university in Beijing, spend 2 weeks in Beijing, and one of the talks I gave was on war poetry, and it was we had several hundred Chinese students in the biggest lecture hall I've ever spoken in. Sorry, that's Pilar's cooking going on. We're in the kitchen. There's all sorts of things going on. Anyway, I was giving the lecture in Beijing, and these students certainly knew their English literature, but they hadn't come across war poetry before. And when I said I was going to do war poetry, I think they were expecting sort of patriotic celebrations of great military triumphs, or maybe something like Charge of the Light Brigade. But when I started by reading to them Wilfred Owen's Futility, in that very large lecture hall, you could have heard a pin drop. You know, it was quite clear talking to them afterwards that, you know, they found something universal in those poems, and which, despite having been written a long way away and a long time ago, clearly had the power to touch them in a very personal way. And I think it's remarkable that those poems from the war still do touch us in this way. They still got a grip on readers when so much of the poetry of that period has, you know, long fallen out of fashion. Of course, along the way, lots of those reputations have changed. There's been great shifting. If you picked up an anthology that was published, say, 100 years ago, that looks very different to one that we would read today. Poets who dominated those anthologies, many of them forgotten. And those anthologies had little or no place for some of the poets we now value most. You know, you won't find in them much Wilfred Owen or Isaac Rosenberg or Ivor Gurney or Edward Thomas, not to mention Mary Borden. And also, when I did the war poets at school in the 1970s, like a lot of you, I think there was very clear direction from, you know, things like we did the John Silken anthology, but also my teachers, that good war poetry was by definition anti-war poetry. And I think today we tend to take a rather more balanced view that the truth is that the attitude to the war expressed by war poets is, you know, is wide-ranging, it's complex, sometimes it's very ambiguous. In other words, it presents that balance of a range of experience that many of the people who were there actually experienced. But for me, what stands out about the best of the war poetry is what I feel is their grounding in compassion and humanity and a gentleness that they found in the midst of these most terrible events. That and a great yearning for peace, for friendship, and the consolations of the natural world. And I think it's those universal values that the students I had in China, that's what they were responding to. And I think that's what we still respond to. And I think some of that is what we're going to hear in some of the poems that we're going to hear this evening. Now, I'm going to introduce each of our readers. I said there are going to be 9 readings as we go along. And so you don't have to remember who is who. And we're going to start with Edna Longley. If Edna, you could start to unmute yourself. It was great to see Edna. Michael's disappeared, but Edna and Michael were sitting together a minute ago. He's there. He's lurking in the background. Good. They're sitting together in Belfast, but we're going to separate them on the program because we were really lucky to have both Edna and Michael. And so we're going to start the program with Edna and finish with Michael. Edna is, for those of you who don't know, she's Professor Emerita of Queen's University Belfast. And among other things, she's especially well known for her work on Edward Thomas. Her recent books include Yeats and Modern Poetry, and also what I think is a terrific book, Under the Same Moon, Edward Thomas and the English Lyric. So Edna, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be part of this event. This autumn, I've already participated in an Edward Thomas Festival and a Robert Graves Symposium, and tonight we seem to have the full pack. And I want to thank the committee of the War Poets Association for bringing us together, locked down as we mostly are in our separate trenches. To make another facile comparison, perhaps the way in which the pandemic has altered everyone's consciousness gives us a bit more insight into how people felt in August 1914. I'm going to read 2 poems by Edward Thomas. No One Cares Less Than I, and As the Team's Head Brass. Thomas wrote both poems in May 1916, when he was thinking about joining the Royal Artillery and about taking the road to France, both of which he did. That decision hovers over As the Team's Head Brass, as when the ploughman asks the main speaker, clearly a soldier in uniform, have you been out? Thomas's reasons for going out when he could have stayed in England are much debated. These 2 poems show that he had absolutely no illusions about the war, but he certainly had some notion of facing a test of bravery, a test which his poems were already facing. Robert Frost put it this way. He said that Thomas went to death because he didn't like going. I've chosen these poems partly because of their many literary ramifications. The War Poets Association emphasizes war and poetry together. I think, with Paul, that the contribution of the great war poets to the making of modern poetry in English is still insufficiently recognized. These poems by Thomas are very aware of their literary contexts. They're in conversation with other poems. No One Cares Less Than I is partly a poem about war poetry itself. What the bugles say, their unreadable message, symbolizes the complexity of representing the war. This poem is also a critique of Rupert Brooke's war sonnets, his bugle sonnets, and If I Should Die sonnet. As the Team's Head Brass is a huge poem. It's a kind of eclogue with deep echoes in the European pastoral tradition, as well as in English pastoral. It exploits the ancient notion of verse itself being based on the versus of the plough, the ploughman's turn into his next furrow. Meanwhile, we can hear talk about the war shaping and changing Thomas's blank verse rhythms. Perhaps our tours of battlefields and cemeteries in areas now restored to agriculture, although still yielding their iron harvest, have helped us to appreciate the war poet's images of landscapes violently transformed, pastoral becoming war pastoral. There's just a hint of the trenches in the toppling clods at the end of As the Team's Head Brass. This poem is also more broadly about the transformation of consciousness, which I mentioned earlier. Thomas encompasses not only the death of rural England and deaths in war, but also the end of the world as formerly understood. So first, no one cares less than I. No one cares less than I. Nobody knows but God whether I am destined to lie under a foreign clod, were the words I made to the bugle call in the morning. But laughing, storming, scorning, only the bugles know what the bugles say in the morning, and they do not care when they blow the call that I heard and made words to early this morning. As the Team's Head Brass. As the Team's Head Brass flashed out on the turn, the lovers disappeared into the wood. I sat among the boughs of the fallen elm that strewed an angle of the fallow and watched the plough narrowing a yellow square of charlock. Every time the horses turned, instead of treading me down, the ploughman leaned upon the handles to say or ask a word about the weather, next about the war. Scraping the share, he faced towards the wood and screwed along the furrow till the brass flashed once more. The blizzard fell the elm whose crest I sat in by a woodpecker's round hole, the ploughman said. When will they take it away? When the war's over. So the talk began, 1 minute and an interval of 10, a minute more and the same interval. Have you been out? No, and don't want to, perhaps. If I could only come back again, I should. I could spare an arm. I shouldn't want to lose a leg. If I should lose my head, why, so, I should want nothing more. Have many gone from here? Yes. Many lost? Yes, a good few. Only 2 teams work on the farm this year. One of my mates is dead. The second day in France, they killed him. It was back in March, the very night of the blizzard, too. Now, if he had stayed here, we should have moved the tree. And I should not have sat here. Everything would have been different, for it would have been another world. Aye, and a better, though if we could see all might seem good. Then the lovers came out of the wood again. The horses started, and for the last time, I watched the clods crumble and topple over after the ploughshare and the stumbling team.
Edna, thank you. That was terrific. Thank you very much indeed. Really, really wonderful. Now we're going to go to Ypres in Belgium and Steve Douglas. And we had a quick look out of Steve's window before. He's right on the square there, looking over the Menin Gate. Steve he runs Salient Tours and the British Grenadier bookshop there in Ypres. And he founded the Maple Leaf Project. And in 2012, he was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for services to Canada. And I think it's certainly a Canadian-linked poet you're going to talk to us about. Over to you, Steve.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Welcome, everybody. Hello. I'm going to do two poems from Robert Service. In my opinion, a very underexposed war poet. He's hardly in any of the anthologies of poetry from the First World War, which I think is a shame. Anyway, I'm going to get right into it. I have two poems I'd like to read. And the first one, if you can imagine, Robert Service, rather, he was from Preston in Lancashire. He went to Canada as a young man for the Klondike Gold Rush. Did not make a fortune there, but ended up working in a bank in the Yukon. And he was a published poet before the war. This particular book of poems, The Rhymes of a Red Cross Man, was published in 1916 in honor of his brother Albert, who was killed just outside of Ypres here. He's buried at Railway Dugout Cemetery. So if you can take yourself to the Somme, for instance, this is a good example on the hot July 1st day of the Battle of the Somme. And try to imagine this scenario, this scene. It's called On the Wire. Oh God, take the sun from the sky. It's burning me, scorching me up. God, can't you hear my cry? Water, a poor little cup. It's laughing, the cursed sun. See how it swells and swells, fierce as 100 hells. God, will it never have done? It's searing the flesh on my bones. It's beating with hammers red my eyeballs into my head. It's parching my very moans. See, it's the size of the sky, and the sky is a torrent of fire, foaming on me as I lie here on the wire, the wire. Of the thousands that wheeze and hum heedlessly over my head, why can't a bullet come, pierce to my brain instead, blacken forever my brain, finish forever my pain? Here in the hellish glare, why must I suffer so? Is it God doesn't know? Sorry, is it God doesn't care? Is it God doesn't know? Oh, to be killed outright, clean in the clash of the fight. That is a golden death. That is a boon. But this, drawing an anguished breath under a hot abyss, under a stooping sky of seething sulfurous fire, scorching me up as I lie here on the wire, the wire. Hasten, O God, thy night. Hide from my eyes the sight of the body I stare and see shattered so hideously. I can't believe that it's mine. My body was white and sweet, flawless and fair and fine, shapely from head to feet. Oh, now I can never be the thing of horror I see under the rifle fire, just on the wire, the wire. Of night and of death I dream, night that will bring me peace, coolness and starry gleam, stillness and death's release. Ages and ages have passed. Lo, it is night at last. Night, but the guns roar out. Night, but the hosts attack. Red and yellow and black, geysers of doom upspout. Silver and green and red, star shells hover and spread. Yonder off to the right, fiercely kindles the fight. Roaring near and more near, thundering now in my ear. Close to me, close. Oh, hark. Someone moans in the dark. I hear, but I cannot see. I hear as the rest retire. Someone is caught like me, caught on the wire, the wire. Again, the shuddering dawn, weird and wicked and wan, again, and I've not yet gone. The man whom I heard is dead. Now I can understand. A bullet hole in his head, a pistol gripped in his hand. Well, he knew what to do. Yes, and now I know too. Hark the resentful guns. Oh, how thankful am I to think my beloved ones will never know how I die. I suffered more than my share. I'm shattered beyond repair. I fought like a man the fight, and now I demand the right. God, how his fingers cling. To do without shame this thing. Good, there's a bullet still. Now I'm ready to fire. Blame me, God, if you will. Here on the wire, the wire. And the second one I'd like to do is called Young Fellow Me Lad. I often read these two poems when I do battlefield tours, and this one is particularly poignant for parents on the tour, parents of teenagers, particularly maybe 17-year-olds. You'll see. Young fellow me lad. Where are you going, young fellow me lad, on this glittering morn of May? I'm going to join the colors, Dad. They're looking for men, they say. But you're only a boy, young fellow me lad. You aren't obliged to go. I'm 17 and a quarter, Dad, and ever so strong, you know. So you're off to France, young fellow me lad, and you're looking so fit and bright. I'm terribly sorry to leave you, Dad, but I feel that I'm doing right. God bless you and keep you, young fellow me lad. You're all of my life, you know. Don't worry, I'll soon be back, dear Dad, and I'm awfully proud to go. Why don't you write, young fellow me lad? I watch for the post each day, and I miss you so, and I'm awfully sad, and it's months since you went away. And I've had the fire in the parlor lit, and I'm keeping it burning bright till my boy comes home. And here I sit into the quiet night. What's the matter, young fellow me lad? No letter again today. Why did the postman look so sad and sigh as he turned away? I hear them tell that we've gained new ground, but a terrible price we've paid. God grant, my boy, that you're safe and sound. But oh, I'm afraid. They've told me the truth, young fellow me lad. You'll never come back again. Oh God, the dreams and dreams I've had, and the hopes I've nursed in vain. For you passed in the night, young fellow me lad, and you proved in the cruel test of the screaming shell and the battle hell, that my boy was one of the best. So you'll live, young fellow me lad, in the gleam of the evening star, in the wood note wild and the laugh of the child, in all sweet things that are. And you'll never die, my wonderful boy, while life is noble and true. For all our beauty and hope and joy, we will owe to our lads like you. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for reminding us about Robert Service. He is in my my anthology of poetry of rescue, people who went to the war but not with a gun in their hand. And he drove an ambulance, and he was he himself was incredibly brave, volunteering for many of the worst missions that were available. But it's also hard these days to imagine quite how popular those poems were in their day. He is, I think, a truly fascinating figure in that world. We now go back to Belfast. This is beginning to feel a bit like Eurovision. Come in, Northern Ireland, Fran. Professor Fran Brearton is also at Queen's University Belfast, and Fran writes about modern British and Irish poetry. She has a particular interest in war poetry and in Robert Graves. She's edited Goodbye to All That for Penguin. Her other books include The Great War in Irish Poetry, W.B. Yeats to Michael Longley, and she has co-edited the Oxford Book of Modern Irish Poetry. And it's great to have you, Fran. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. It's lovely to be here. I have a feline army outside the door waiting to invade, but I'm going to hold them at bay, I hope, to give me time to read 3 poems by respectively Frances Ledwidge, Wilfred Owen and Ted Hughes, and I'll just say a little bit about each of them before I read it. So Frances Ledwidge, for those of you who don't know his work, is an Irishman, indeed an Irish nationalist, who enlisted in the British Army in 1914. He was killed in the Third Battle of Ypres on 31st of July 1917, blown to bits just over a fortnight before his 30th birthday. Now, the poem I'm going to read is not explicitly a First World War poem. It's an elegy for his friend Thomas MacDonagh, who was executed by the British in May 1916 for his part in the Easter Rising in Dublin. Ledwidge had been invalided back to England from Serbia just after the Easter Rising took place, and he wrote of his grief that MacDonagh and Pearse, two of my best friends, are dead, shot by England. So the poem is a moving elegy for the dead of Easter 1916, those called traitors by people wearing the same uniform as Ledwidge himself. But I've also chosen it because it contains within it a subtle lament for the dead of the war too, with its wailing of the rain, loud march, fanfare shrill. It has in it the language of the First World War, of spring offensives, of the call to arms, the wailing of shellfire creeping into the Irish tradition. It predates Wilfred Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth, with its shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, but I think we see in Ledwidge the beginnings of what Owen later brought to fruition, reworking a romantic idiom to powerful effect in the context of modern war. So this is Ledwidge's elegy, simply titled Thomas MacDonagh. He shall not hear the bittern cry in the wild sky where he is lain, nor voices of the sweeter birds among the wailing of the rain. Nor shall he know when loud March blows through slanting snows her fanfare shrill, blowing to flame the golden cup of many an upset daffodil. But when the dark cow leaves the moor and pastures poor with greedy weeds, perhaps he'll hear her low at morn, lifting her horn in pleasant meads. Ledwidge was killed just as my second poet, Wilfred Owen, as I'm sure everybody knows, was invalided home from the front and therefore began in August 1917, that intense writing period that produced most of his best known poems through to his death in 1918. Like Ledwidge, we hear romantic pastoral leanings, but with none of the consolation we might expect from the natural world. Instead, and I'm going to be brave and read a poem I think I love better than I can express, we have the bitter ironies of futility, in which the sun can't rouse the dead. And Futility was first published in The Nation on the 16th of June, 1918. So in Futility. Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once at home, whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full-nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Or what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? And I have one more extract from Owen. It's not from the poems, but it's from a letter to Sassoon he wrote on the 10th of October, 1918. It is a strange truth, he wrote, that your counterattack, Sassoon's poem of that title, your counterattack frightened me much more than the real one, though the boy by my side, shot through the head, lay on top of me, soaking my shoulder for half an hour. Catalogue, photograph. Can you photograph the crimson hot iron as it cools from the smelting? That is what Jones's blood looked like and felt like. My senses are charred. I shall feel again as soon as I dare, but now I must not. I don't take the cigarette out of my mouth when I write deceased over their letters. Now, Owen worries here partly about how experience might be or can't be communicated through image, smell, sound, words. Poetry, he implies in the tribute to Sassoon's counterattack, can perhaps do more than anything else here. So I decided to finish with a post-war poem by Ted Hughes. He is, along with Michael Longley, who we'll hear from later, one of the most war-haunted of contemporary poets. I think in both cases, their imaginative return to a great war they never experienced is mediated both through those poets who did experience it, as also through inherited familial memories of wartime service. Both Hughes's father and Longley's father served in the Great War. The poem I've chosen by Hughes is, of course, Wilfred Owen's Photographs, written in the summer of 1958. Hughes tells us that Owen carried about photographs of trench horrors that he would have liked to see magnified and put on public display in London. Unable to do so, Hughes argues that his desire was for people to see the horrors of war diverted into the writing, so that Owen's poems become a kind of verbal parallel to the photograph of atrocity. Now, Hughes's poem, despite its title, isn't about Owen, but it's about following Owen and showing how a direct encounter with the image of violence and brutality can bring about a change in perspective. In this instance, the 1881 suspension of flogging in the British Navy. And it brings me back to the beginning too. For those of you who don't know the poem, I'll just explain that the witty, profound Irishman in it is John O'Connor Power, nationalist MP for County Mayo in the early 80s, and a man who later spoke out in the First World War about the betrayal of those Irishmen like Francis Ledwidge, who gave their lives in the British Army for the promise of Irish independence, but were, as he saw it, betrayed. So this is Ted Hughes, Wilfred Owen's Photographs. When Parnell's Irish in the House pressed that the British Navy's cat and nine tails be abolished, what shot against them? It was neither Irish nor English nor that decade, but of the species. Predictably, Parliament squared against the motion. As soon let the old school tie be rent off their necks and give thanks, as sea gone no shame but a monument, Trafalgar not better known. To discontinue it were as much as ship not powder and cannonballs, but brandy and women, laughter. Hearing which, a witty, profound Irishman calls for a cat into the house and sits to watch the gentry fingering its stained tails. Whereupon, quietly, unopposed, the motion was passed.
Fran, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you very much, and thank you for such an interesting framing of those poems as well. We now go. I can't see him on my screen, but I know he's here. Tim Kendall. Tim is president of the War Poets Association, and he's also professor of English at the University of Exeter. He's well known for many things, but especially his work on Ivor Gurney and war poetry in general. He's the editor of the terrific Oxford Anthology of Poetry of the First World War, and I understand he's currently working on an anthology of poetry of the Second World War, also for Oxford, which we look forward to very much. So, Tim.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. I hope you can all hear me clearly. It's not always guaranteed in East Devon, but I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. I'm going to be reading today 3 poems by Ivor Gurney. They're all short poems. They have something in common. They are poems about weapons of war. They're also they have a humor of phlegmatism under fire. So humor as a kind of coping mechanism is coming through these poems. And the other reason I chose them is that we think there are about, well, we've counted, there are about 1,600 Gurney poems that survive. And when I started working on him with my colleague Philip Lancaster about 10 years ago, at that point, only about 300 of them had been put into print. Not always the best, it must be said. I'm going to be reading 3 poems that Philip and I are responsible for publishing. I really hope that you like them, because I've just wasted 10 years of my life if you don't. So fingers crossed for these anyway. Now, the first one is called La Rime, and you need to know a couple of things. First of all, the red house that is mentioned is the Gloucester Regiment's headquarters in that part of the line. And the second thing is that Gurney refers, as he does in another poem I'm going to read, he refers to the Germans as Fritz, which is a much nicer appellation than the Hun. You know, Fritz is the kind of brother and the mirror image of Tommy. So there's something quite endearing about the word Fritz. So this is, it actually contains a self-portrayal at the end that you'll notice as well. La Rime. Fritz caught a sight of a fatigue party going down, probably just ended, having escaped observation. So this offended Fritz, and he let fly with everything of powder, cordite, or TNT. One did his bootlace. One lit his pipe and cursed ration tobacco and said, "Boys, this is war at the worst." One blew his nose. One plucked at a dead nettle growing above the trench side. Nobody ran. One, having written 7 lines to rhyme and scan, so to say, raised his umbrella and cursed Fritz, who never had nor never would produce poets, and at the Red House said sudden, "I see that's the one," finished his 8th line and blasted home critics to bits. I think one of the reasons I like that poem so much is it's a poem about a bombardment, and the only people that get blasted to bits are these wretched home critics, who are presumably people who don't appreciate Gurney's poetry or his music as much as they should. And similarly, the only thing that's dead in the poem is actually not dead at all. It's a dead nettle growing on the trench side. So it's kind of ghosted by the language of death and destruction, while actually, it kind of reminds you of it while slightly holding it at bay. The next poem I'm going to read is a poem called Joyeuse et Durandal. And these 2 items in the poem's title, you notice this is the second French title in a row. These 2 items, Joyeuse and Durandal, are named after swords. In Charlemagne's sword, Emperor Charlemagne's sword was called Joyeuse, and his paladin Roland, his sword was called Durandal. In Gurney's poem, he's talking about 2 bayonets which are given these names. And he's rather regretting the upgrade that he's been given. He wants the bayonet used by the old army before the war, which was much more stylish, and is instead the upgrade is rather, in his mind, rather to be regretted and rather an ugly looking thing. Just one other thing you need to know, which is that there's a reference to green envelopes in the poem. And as some of you will know, a green envelope is a kind of special privilege for soldiers who want to send a letter home that's guaranteed not to be opened by the censors. So if you've got something really personal that you want to say to someone, you write it in the envelope, and the understanding being, of course, you don't give away any secrets, but the censor, the gentleman's agreement being the censor isn't going to read it. So the green envelopes were very, very valuable. They were bartered in the trenches. Gurney refers to them here. Okay. Joyeuse et Durandal. Joyeuse, O lovely bayonet of the old army, why have they given us this grey thing with which to slay? Durandal, you are longer, certainly not stronger, and have no looks to speak of. We would risk the danger of an extra 3 inches of German weapon if they would grant that, if they would grant that bare bright steel again. War Office would spare green envelopes with Charlie and do worrying fatigues on rest for a day, entreat the colonel and the sergeant major, so we might joyously have our gaze upon this bright and fashioned lord, not for honor, in vain. For they would fight with formulae and with figures, but we with songs and praises and more soldiers, having caressed that fair blade with long fingers. Now, of course, caress fair blade with long fingers, you don't need to be Freud to raise an eyebrow at that line. It's, of course, a poem that's tapping into a subgenre, which is the kind of cult of the bayonet, which you find in French tradition in particular. The French loved their bayonets. They called the bayonet Rosalie, and it became a royal. You can see something of Gurney's kind of inheritance of that French tradition in his poem. Final poem about a weapon of war. It's called the Stokes Gunners. And the Stokes gun was a very handy weapon because, oh, I've got a message saying my internet connection is unstable, so fingers crossed. This weapon, because it's a portable gun, easy to maneuver around the trenches, very unpopular with your own side, because what would happen is that someone would turn up, a team of Stokes gunners would turn up, they would blast the enemy from a position of retreat to somewhere else, back behind the lines, and then the Germans, having been woken up by this bombardment, would reply in kind. So nobody ever wanted the Stokes gunners to come to their part of that. I think that's probably everything. Yeah, okay, so the Stokes gunners. Fritz and we were nearly on friendly terms, of mornings furtively, oh moral insects, worms, a group of khaki people would saunter into our sector and plant a stovepipe, its trenches, insert black things shaped like tickler's jams. The stovepipe hissed 100 times, and one might count to 100 damned unexpected explosions, which was all very well, but the group, having finished performance and hissed and whistled, would take their contrivance down to headquarters to report damage, hand in forms, while the Gloucesters, who desired peace or desired battle, were left to pay the piper, cursing Stokes to hell, Montreal, and Seattle. Thank you very much. Paul, back to you.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you. That's really very, very good. Thank you. I mean, we're getting such an interesting range of poets here, and such an interesting range of perceptions. It's really terrific. And I'm seeing, not everybody can see the chats, but some people are coming in and saying very nice things about the poems that are being chosen and read. So thank you for that. Next up, we're going to have a poet Antony Owen, whose work often explores the consequences of conflict in sort of new and interesting ways. And he's published 5 collections of poetry, including The Nagasaki Elder and The Unknown Civilian. He also has a poem, very good poem, in the current edition of the War Poetry Review. So, Antony.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to the WPA, and everybody that's turned up. The listeners are the most important people, or else there'd be no point of poetry. So the first poem I want to read is by Ewart Alan McIntosh. He was killed in action in November 1917. He was 24 years old. He's a Scottish poet. His best poetry has been sort of compared to Rupert Brooke. What I like about this poem is it exhumes the individual, the human, from the machinations of the soldier and the training. I think it really brings it home. I'm just going to read the poem, it's quite a long one. So you were David's father, and he was your only son, and the new-cut peats are rotting, and the work is left undone because of an old man weeping, just an old man in pain. For David, his son David, that will not come again. Oh, these letters he wrote you, and I can see them still. Not a word of the fighting, but just the sheep on the hill. And how you should get the crops in as the year gets stormier and the Boches have got his body and I was his officer. You were only David's father, but I had 50 sons. When we went up in the evening under the arch of the guns and we came back at twilight, oh God, I heard them call to me for help and pity that could not help them at all. Or never will I forget you, my men that trusted me, more my sons than your fathers. For they could only see the little helpless babies and the young men in their pride. They could not see you dying and hold you while you died. Happy and young and gallant, they saw the firstborn go, but not the strong limbs broken and the beautiful men brought low. The piteous writhing bodies, they screamed, "Don't leave me, sir." For they were only your fathers, but I was your officer. The next poem is very, it's an unknown poet, I think, to everyone here. Did a bit of research the other day because there was a duplicated choice that somebody else was reading, a poet that I chose. It's called Chance Memory. It was basically regarding a lane on the way to the Cranley Officers Training Corps. It was originally in the Daily News in June 1916, and the poet's name was given as Philip Johnson, but it wasn't actually Philip Johnson. Years later, and I'm going to share the link later, it transpired about 50 years later that it was actually a vicar that didn't want anybody to know about the story. His wife actually saw an advert for some information about the original publication, and to cut a long story short, they found out that the poem was written by Purvis. So this poem is, sorry, I just found it. This poem here, it's not the most powerful poem I've read on World War I, but it does show to me the land that nature makes and the land war makes. There's a German poet called August Strand that wrote a poem called Wund, and that very much describes the battlefield as a living wound that war creates. This is quite similar to that in some respects. I can't forget the lane that goes from Staining to the Ring. In summertime and on the downs, how larks and linnets sing. High in the sun, the wind comes off the sea, and oh, the air. I never knew till now that life in old days was so fair. But now I know it, in this filthy, rat-infested trench, where every shell must kill our spare, and God alone knows which. And I am made a beast of prey, and this trench is my lair. My God, I never knew till now that those days were so fair. And we assault in half an hour, and it's a silly thing. I can't forget the lane that goes from Staining to the Ring. The last two poems I'll finish on. The first poem I'm going to read is A Black Nurse Tends to Wounds, and it was inspired by one of the 18 black nurses who joined the Red Cross from the Caribbean, and this is regarding one of their testimonies. By morning, the dead turn bottle green, pouring their vapours back to the reborn sun. We do not tell the dying that the Lord never sent his sign. I shall tell you of the crow and mockingbird that war made the natural. Last night I heard a mockingbird mimic the cries across the plateau. I heard a nickering horse and the sound a tree makes when it dies. Today I was watching a crow steal lint and viscera from a man. Last week he placed a name in my ear, so heavy it felt. By dusk I rubbed gin beneath my nostrils and pray. There once was a hymn my mother sang that healed me. In Dominica it was the west wind cleaned by the tears of Jesus. She told me as a child that if I hurt, I should let the Lord in to heal me. Last week the colours ran from War Shalom to Coventry, black to white. With blood-stained khaki, we turned the horse troughs purple. The bandy-legged nags took their bodies to a lime trench. All of their bodies shall be white. and grow as red opiates. I should mention that I'm a black nurse in white man's world of war. My hardest battle is tending to a wound that keeps reappearing. There was a boy that would not leave my eyes as he went. You're an angel, he said. My wings were black, broken. The final poem is one of the first poems in my book, The Unknown Civilian. And, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, was 4'10". He survived the Somme. He was in the Lancashire Regiment. Later on became a tunneler for the Welsh Regiment. And he lived till the late 60s. He died of his third stroke. Apparently suffered very bad post-traumatic stress disorder, which wasn't called PTSD back then. It went from obviously shell shock, battle fatigue to PTSD. But this is a poem called "The Last Minute of Wilfred Owen's Life," and I kept on thinking what he must have gone through in those final moments. What did he have in his pockets? What was his last sort of thoughts after all those moments of such lucidity and poetry and beauty? 1. Crossing the canal. The soldier cannot withstand his heart's artillery. Like a drummer boy's, it knows the ebb and flow of fear. Did you know that a typewriter was pounding your laid bare soul? This is the last minute of Wilfred Owen's life under fire and water. A half-written poem the world never knew bled with him. The machine gunner's anthem smashed their full stops. 2. Cheerio then. It is vital to be polite and wish your chums cheerio, dying gentlemanly. A poet who writes from his wounds uses the blackest ink. It curlicues into water as he floats like a sonnet read by a tipsy Irishman. 3. The Dead Orchestra. There is no armistice for soldiers who know the fib of poppies, who know that the dead blow black bugles of fungi. They go on for miles where the iron soil disturbs. 4. Glorious. Let's do this properly and write war poems with etiquette. The glorious soldier, mouth permanently unlocked, writes something in Latin to dress death elegantly. 5. The woman poet. Come, pawn me the mad metal cross and jewelers across Wirral. Come wear me a poem, brand my ears with dulce decorum. Last night a nurse read her war poem to tin soldiers of shell shock. You.
Antony, thank you very much. Very good. Thank you very much indeed. We now go to Oxford, where Professor Santanu Das is Senior Research Fellow at All Souls College. And his work often explores the relationship between experience, writing, and culture in times of conflict, and with a particular reference to the First World War. His recent books include India, Empire, and First World War Culture, Writing, Images, and Songs, and that came out in 2018. Santanu.
Thanks, Paul. Well, Wilfred Owen has been a running kind of strand, and Paul, you mentioned speaking about Wilfred Owen in China. So I've chosen a poem which shows how Owen was touched by the East. And it's a poem about touch, and also how we are touched by writing across language and vast distances, perhaps opposite for a phantasmal year like the present one. It's a poem by the Indian writer Rabindranath Tagore, who got the Nobel Prize in 1913 for his collection Gitanjali, a collection that W.B. Yeats liked so much that he said he would often read it in private, lest people could see how very moved he was. And the poem I'm going to read is by no means Tagore's kind of best poem, but I find the circumstances around it uniquely moving. And you'll see why. I start with a letter by Susan Owen, Wilfred's mother, written on August 1st, 1920. Dear Sir Rabindranath, the letter may never reach you, for I do not know how to address it, though I feel your name upon the envelope will be sufficient. It is nearly 2 years ago that my dear eldest son went out to the war for the last time. And the day he said goodbye to me, we were looking together across the sun-glorified sea, looking towards France with breaking hearts, when he, my poet son, said these wonderful words of yours. যাবার দিনে এই কথাটি বলে যেন যাই, যা দেখেছি, যা পেয়েছি, তুলনা তার নাই. And I'll now read the poem in translation. When I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I've seen is unsurpassable. I've tasted of the hidden honey of this lotus that expands on the ocean of light, and thus I'm blessed. Let this be my parting word. In this playhouse of infinite forms, I've had my play, and here I have caught sight of him who is formless. My whole body and my limbs have thrilled with his touch, who is beyond touch. And if the end comes here, let it come. Let this be my parting word. And I find this poem and Owen's kind of selection of this poem quite remarkable, because it is not a poem about war. It's a poem about thanksgiving and about immortal longings, which resonate so closely with the preface that Owen writes. And the second thing that is important is sound. I think Owen has an extraordinary sensitivity to sound, as in his relationship to French poetry. And it is interesting that I think Tagore is one of those poets who gets completely lost in translation. In Bengali, he's a great poet. In English translation, he's just about maybe a good poet. And while Tagore was being blasted in the West by the likes of Wyndham Lewis, I find it immensely moving that Owen would not just read him, but would have an intuitive grasp over the sonic qualities of Tagore's poem, because he quotes the poem in Bengali to Suzanne Owen. And as in Owen, in Tagore too, often sound is sense. Like, for example, Fran kind of read out my favorite, also kind of Futility, which is also my favorite or kind of poem by Owen. And a poet that can weave such kind of magic kind of wisps of sound, like the sibilance or the F, he also responds intuitively to kind of Tagore's kind of sounds in a different tongue. And the final point, it's also about touch. Tagore is Owen is a poet who is kind of obsessed with the sense of touch. And again, here in his gravitation towards this particular poem, I think touch and homoeroticism and God, they touch and blend in ways that is kind of very kind of difficult to explain. And I think what we have here is a certain appetite for the incorrigible plurality of life, as well as a certain expansive spirituality. And I will just end with a few lines again from Tagore. This is Tagore writing in 1922, when he visits the trenches and stands not very far from where Owen had died. And Tagore is here writing in English. Lately, I went to visit some battlefields of France which had been devastated by war. the awful calm of desolation, which still wore wrinkles of pain. Death struggle stiffened into ugly ridges, brought before my mind the vision of a huge demon, which had no shape, no meaning, yet had two arms that could strike and break and tear, a gaping mouth that could devour, and bulging brains that could conspire and plan. It was a purpose which had a living body, but no complete humanity to temper it. Because it was passion, belonging to life, and yet not having the wholeness of life. It was the most terrible of life's enemies. Something of the same sense of oppression in a different degree, the same desolation in a different aspect, is produced in my mind when I realize the effect of the West upon Eastern life. The West, which in its relation to us is all plan and purpose incarnate, without any superfluous humanity. Thanks.
Santanu, thanks. That was incredibly interesting, and I'm going to go straight and read some Tagore tomorrow. I think it's and take it in a new way. It was really, really very illuminating. Thank you. Our next reader is Bel Mooney, and Bel joins us from Somerset. Bel, of course, is a well-known, distinguished, prolific journalist, broadcaster, novelist. She's published 6 novels, as well as many books for children. She's presented programs on BBC television, radio. She particularly hosted the BBC Radio 4 series, The Devout Skeptics. She is probably best known, I guess, at the moment for her deservedly very popular advice columns that started, I think, Bel, in the Times, but now are to be found in the Daily Mail. So, Bel, over to you.
Well, I'm going to read, hello everybody, I'm going to read 3 poems which focus on the experience of women. The first one comes from this anthology. It's just called Scars Upon My Heart, and it's an anthology of mostly pretty well unknown women wrote in the First World War. The title comes from a letter that, a poem that Vera Brittain wrote to her brother. And the quote is, "Your battle wounds are scars upon my heart." And it does reflect the fact that, in all wars, women are waiting at home. Obviously, there are other experiences too of fighting and serving and looking after people. But I'm thinking of first of the women who wait at home. And here we have somebody called Jessie Pope, who was a journalist. And this poem is called Socks. Now, I'm not a knitter, but I want you to know that the last line of every verse is a knitting instruction, knitting and purling, and I don't do those things, but anyway. Here is Jessie Pope knitting, as so many women did, socks. Shining pins that dart and click in the fireside's sheltered peace, check the thoughts that cluster thick, 20 plain and then decrease. He was brave, well, so was I, keen and merry, but his lip quivered when he said goodbye, past the seam stitch, purl and slip. Never used to living rough, lots of things he'd got to learn, wonder if he's warm enough, knit 2, catch 2, knit 1, turn. Hark, the paper boys again. Wish that shout could be suppressed, keeps one always on the strain. Knit off 9 and slip the rest. Wonder if he's fighting now, what he's done and where he's been. He'll come out on top somehow. Slip 1, knit 2, purl 14. And now to the front. And this, I'm reading from Paul O'Pre's collection, selection of Mary Borden's poem. Mary Borden was an extraordinary woman. She was an American, a rather wealthy American, who funded her own field hospital on the Somme. And in the first week, they treated 25,000 wounded. In 1916, she fell in love with a handsome young British officer. She was married. It was a scandalous affair. He was called Louis Spears. Now, I've chosen this poem, not one of the ones from her prose work, The Forbidden Zone, which has 6 poems, I think, at the end, and which are very dramatic, like the poem about mud. But I'm not choosing those. This one reflects 2 experiences. She is the nurse looking after gravely wounded men. And the part of the poem expresses not the sentiment, but the sheer horror of that experience. And it's counterpointed with this passion, this longing for the man she loves to take her away from all the hell. And I just love this juxtaposition. It's very dramatic. It's called Come to Me Quickly. Come to me quickly and take me away from my wounded men. I cannot bear their pain anymore. Come quickly and take me away out of this place. Give me rest. Give me strength. Then give me cleanness and joy for 1 hour. I'm suffocating. I cannot get away. They cling to my skirts, my arms, my hands. They clutch at my strength. They call my name. They keep calling me. They cry to me to undo their pain and let them free. I cannot set them free. Come to me for 1 hour, strong, clean, whole. Their wounds gape at me. Their stumps menace me. Their bandaged faces grimace at me. Their death rattle curses me. Give me rest. Make me clean. I'm stained, I'm soiled, I am streaked with their blood. I am soaked with the odor of the oozing of their wounds. I'm saturated with the poison of their poor festering wounds. I'm poisoned, I'm infected. I shall never wash it off. But you are clean. Let me drink the fresh moisture of your face with my lips. Your garments are electric with the wind blowing through them. Put your gallant cloak about me. Let me breathe, give me rest, that I may be light, light. For I'm heavy with the weight of my helpless, wounded men. I can bear no more the weight of their rolling heads, their broken limbs, their inert bodies. Give me strength. Stop the shaking of my hands. I'm shaking. I cannot keep them from shaking. I'm shaking because I've had to be strong for so long. When they clung to me, I held them. When they tossed, I held them still. When they fought, I held them down. When they clutched at me, sinking, drowning in their agony, I held them. Oh, how I tried to hold them up and save them. But their pain was so strong that it's left me shaking. I can't hold them anymore. Give me strength. And give me joy, I beseech you. Give me joy for 1 hour, that I may go back again to comfort them. Take me out through the dark and up the hill, where the wind and the roar of cannon surge and beat about us, where the flares run red through the wide, luminous blackness. There, speak to me quietly, you who've never failed me. Say my name with confidence. Repeat my name. The sound of your voice saying my name assures me that I have always sufficed you. Listen, I hear their delirium calling. Speak to me quietly. Let the war thunder. Tell me that in our house the chimney fires are burning, the quiet rooms are waiting. Hold me still and let me listen to the faint, far echoing music of the youth we had together. Hold me and let me hear the chanting of the years, all the years you have loved me. Ah, you who have always loved me, come to me for an hour, then let me go back to my wounded men. And we move away from the battlefield, again to women who wait and grieve. This one I'm reading from Tim Kendall's wonderful anthology, Poetry of the First World War. This is May Cannon. And May Cannon volunteered in 1915 to work in a canteen serving soldiers. And in 1918, she worked in the War Office Department in Paris. This is a very, very sad poem about the grief. I mean, it always makes me cry, so I'll try not to. It's called The Armistice, in an office in Paris. The news came through over the telephone. All the terms had been signed. The war was won. And all the fighting and the agony and all the labor of the years were done. One girl clicked sudden at her typewriter and whispered, "Jerry's safe," and sat and stared. One said, "It's over, over. It's the end. The war is over, ended." And a third, "I can't remember life without the war." And one came in and said, "Look here, they say we can all go at 5 to celebrate, as long as 2 stay on just for today." It was quiet in the big empty room among the typewriters and the little piles of index cards. One said, "We'd better just finish the day's reports and do the files," and said, "It's awfully like recessional now when the tumult's died away." The other said, "Thank God we saw it through. I wonder what they'll do at home today." And said, "You know, it will be quiet tonight up at the front. First time in all these years. And no one will be killed there anymore." And stopped to hide her tears. She said, "I've told you, he was killed in June." The other said, "My dear, I know. It's over for me too. My man was killed, wounded and died at Ypres 3 years ago. And he's my man, and I want him," she said, and knew that peace would not give back her dead.
Thank you, Bel. It's wonderful to hear those poems, especially that May Cannon poem. And you're right, that May Wedderburn Cannon is a great poet, I think, who wrote some really very moving poems. And it was interesting that phone call. She was, when she was working for British intelligence in the British Embassy, it was her who took the first call to Paris announcing the armistice. And she describes in her memoirs how everybody, you know, it was hard for her to hear what was being said on this sort of crackly telephone line, because everybody was crowding around her and demanding to know what was being told to her. And it's great she captured that moment. Before we go to our last speaker, I'm going to read 3 poems by Robert Graves. And I can see on the screen, I think, at least 5 members of Graves' family here. And so I just wanted to say a particular welcome to them. I can see William in Palma, and Lucia and Frank in London, and Natalia in London, and Laia down with me and Pilar here in Brighton. And it's great to have them. And I also see Charles Mundy, who's president of the Robert Graves Society. So it's very good. And I'm going to read 3 poems. Robert, as many of you will know, he volunteered just as he finished school, and he took a commission in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He served as a captain in the regiment, and was very badly wounded in the lung at the Somme. That happened in a very small village called Bazentin-le-Petit. And I vividly remember a few years ago walking around Bazentin with William, and I think it was Richard Percival Graves and a few others. And we were using Goodbye to All That and some of Robert's letters to try and locate, because Robert describes this moment very graphically, try and find the exact spot. And just by the cemetery there, we found a big, what looked like the crater of a shell hit. And we thought that might be it. And I picked up, it was very chalky soil, and I picked up this little bit of chalk that I still keep on my desk, William, reminding me of that moment. It was what kept Robert going through all of that was a very strong sort of feeling of comradeship with his fellow soldiers, strong friendships with people like Siegfried Sassoon, a strong sense of duty to the men under his command. That, and I think probably a great deal of whiskey. But his closest friend in the regiment was Siegfried Sassoon, and they shared their poems with each other. This was other officers had a very dim view of subalterns who wrote poetry, so they used to refer to their poems as rum punch, and a new recipe for rum punch meant that they had a new poem that they could share with each other. This is one of several poems that Robert wrote to Siegfried, and it's about their time near Bazentin, and he mentions in the poem Fricourt, Festubert, villages just around there in Picardy, and it's called Two Fusiliers. And have we done with war at last? Well, we've been lucky devils both, and there's no need of pledge or oath to bind our lovely friendship fast. By firmer stuff, close bound enough. By wire and wood and stake we're bound, by Fricourt and by Festubert, by whipping rain, by the sun's glare, by all the misery and loud sound, by a spring day, by Picard clay. Show me the two so closely bound as we, by the wet bond of blood, by friendship blossoming from mud, by death. We faced him, and we found beauty in death, in dead men, breath. In another, Robert loved the regimental tradition. He loved that sense of belonging that the regiment could offer. But he didn't always have an easy time. The old army veterans in the regiment, who had served for many years, they tended to give the young subalterns, the young lieutenants, a hard time, and especially Robert, because his German middle name von Ranke made some of them think that maybe he was a spy. So he was very sympathetic to those old army hands who gave, in particular, the new army, the Kitchener army, the conscripts, got a particularly rough time from some of the old school sergeant majors, and this describes one of the more particularly brutal sergeant majors, called Sergeant Major Money. It wasn't our battalion, but we lay alongside it, so the story's as true as the telling is frank. They hadn't one line officer left after Arras, except a batty major and the colonel, who drank. B Company commander was fresh from the depot, an expert on gas drill, otherwise a dud. So Sergeant Major Money carried on as instructed, and that's where the swaddies began to sweat blood. His old army humour was so well spiced and hearty that one poor sod shot himself and one lost his wits. But discipline's maintained, and back in rest billets, the colonel congratulates B Company on their kits. The subalterns went easy, as was only natural with a terror like Money driving the machine, till finally two Welshmen, butties from the Ronda, bayoneted their bugbear in a field canteen. Well, we couldn't blame the officers. They relied on money. We couldn't blame the pit boys. Their courage was grand. Or least of all, blame money, an old stiff, surviving in a new bloody army he couldn't understand. The final poem I'm going to read is called Last Day of Leave, and it describes a moment of peace in the war where he's having a picnic on the hills above Harlech, where the family had a holiday home, and just about to go back to the front. And this is the last day of leave. We five looked out over the moor at rough hills blurred with haze and a still sea. Our tragic day, bountiful from the first. We would spend it by the lily lake, high in a fold beyond the farthest ridge, following the cart track till it faded out. The time of berries and bell heather. Yet all that morning, nobody went by but shepherds and one old man carting turfs. We were in love, he with her, she with him, and I, the youngest one, the odd man out, as deep in love with a yet nameless muse. No cloud, larks and heath butterflies and herons undisturbed fishing the streams. A slow, cool breeze that hardly stirred the grass. When we hurried down the rocky slope, a flock of ewes galloping off in terror, there shone the water lilies, yellow and white. Deep water and a shelving bank. Off went our clothes, and in we went, all five, diving like trout between the lily groves. The basket had been nobly filled. Wine and fresh rolls, chicken and pineapple, our braggadocio under threat of war. The fire on which we boiled our kettle we fed with ling and rotten blackthorn root. And the coffee tasted memorably of peat. Two of us might stray off together, but never less than three kept by the fire, focus of our uncertain destinies. We spoke little, our minds in tune. A sigh or laugh would settle any theme. The sun so hot it made the rocks quiver. But when it rolled down level with us, 4 pairs of eyes sought mine, as if appealing for a blind fate aversive afterward. Do you remember the Lily Lake? We were all there, all 5 of us in love, not one yet killed, widowed, or broken-hearted. So finally, we come to Michael Longley, back to Belfast. Michael, of course, is one of our best known, our most admired poets. He's the author of numerous collections of poetry, including The Stairwell, which won the 2015 International Griffin Prize. The Weather of Japan in 2000, that won the Irish Times Literature Prize of Poetry, the Hawthornden Prize, and the T.S. Eliot Prize. The following year, he was awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, and his most recent collection is called The Candlelight Master. Michael, great to see you. Over to you. You need to unmute yourself, Michael.
Am I unmuted? Yeah, okay. It's great to see you all. And I want to begin with 2 poems I revere. The first, by Isaac Rosenberg, appears in all the anthologies, and the second, by Siegfried Sassoon, appears in far too few anthologies. And the first poem is Break of Day in the Trenches. The darkness crumbles away. It is the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaps my hand, a queer sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English hand, you will do the same to a German soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chanced than you for love, for life, bonds to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes at the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens? What quaver, what heart aghast? Poppies whose roots are in man's veins drop and are ever dropping. But mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust. And the second poem by Siegfried Sassoon, The Dugout. Why do you lie with your legs ungainly huddled, and one arm bent across your sullen, cold, exhausted face? It hurts my heart to watch you, deep shadowed from the candle's guttering gold. And you wonder why I shake you by the shoulder. Drowsy, you mumble and sigh and turn your head. You are too young to fall asleep forever. And when you sleep, you remind me of the dead. Aren't those last two lines devastating? You are too young to fall asleep forever. And when you sleep, you remind me of the dead. Wilfred Owen was killed when he and his men were building pontoons across the canal at Oars. When I stood at the exact spot on the towpath, I found myself still willing him to make it across. My poem Oars is mainly about this. The second stanza is about the, for me, wonderful coincidence that my daughter Rebecca lives in Edinburgh, opposite the house where Wilfred visited a Jewish family for cultural evenings. They were called, they were the Stenthals. And stanza 3 recalls a reading I gave a few years ago at Craig Lockhart Hospital, where Robert Graves, Sassoon and Owen coincided. Oars. I am standing on the canal bank at Oars, willing Wilfred Owen to make it across to the other side where his parents wait. He and his men are constructing pontoons. The German sniper doesn't know his poetry. My daughter Rebecca lives in 24 St. Bernard's Crescent, opposite the home Wilfred visited for perfect little dinners and extraordinary fellowship in all the arts. I can hear him on his way to the Steinthals. Last year, I read my own poems at Craiglockhart and eavesdropped on Robert, Siegfried, Wilfred, whispering about poetry down the corridors. If Wilfred can concentrate a little longer, he might just make it to the other bank. On one of Andy Thompson's brilliant battlefield pilgrimages, I was deeply moved to watch Isaac Rosenberg's nephew, Bernard Winnick, placing a pebble on the poet's headstone according to Jewish custom. And Bernard, I see you're among us. Good to see you again. And there's a short poem I wrote called A Pebble. I'd like to show you though his picture before I read the poem. Can you see it? Isaac Rosenberg's picture. Yeah. Portrait, I should say. And I read this especially for you, Bernard. A pebble. Kneeling, he lays on Isaac Rosenberg, his uncle's headstone, a pebble, a paperweight holding down the poems. For him and the other pilgrims, I read aloud Dead Man's Dump, one of the greatest poems in the world, I say. Is he really buried here? His face keeps reappearing. His nephew with a pebble. His long, sad Treblinka face. Um, 70 years ago, I brought home from school a harmonica. To my surprise, my father, a Great War survivor, picked it up and started to play. For years, I'd wanted to write about this, but it wasn't until I read about the early Greek philosopher Anaximenes. He believed that the basis of all creation was air. I should have said that in the trenches, my father and his chums taught themselves to play the harmonica, and they produced improvised marches for. Anyway, Anaximenes breathed life into this memory, and as I say, he believed that the basis of all creation was air. And in my poem Harmonica, I refer to a musical favorite, and the tune I have in mind, you can choose your own. The tune I have in mind is It's a Long Way to Tipperary. This is my favorite poem of mine, Harmonica. A Tommy drops his harmonica in no man's land. My dad, like old Anaximenes, breathes in and out through the holes and reeds and finds this melody. Our souls are air. They hold us together. Listen. A music hall favorite lasts until the end of time. My dad is playing it. His breath contains the world. The wind is playing an orchestra of harmonicas. My penultimate poem is called Edward Thomas's poem. Edward Thomas's poem. It's in the singular. Thank you, Edna. My PA is doing a very good job here. I couldn't make out the minuscule handwriting in the notebook the size of his palm and crinkled like an origami quim by shell blast that stopped his pocket watch at death. I couldn't read the poem. From where he lay, he could hear the skylark's skyward exultation, a chaffinch to his left, fidgeting among the fallen branches, then all the birds of the western front. The nature poet turned into a war poet as if he could cure death with the rub of a dock leaf. I'll end with a found poem. It's a poem found in Helen Thomas's account of her visit to Ivor in Dartford Asylum, which was a prison, as she says. On her second visit, Helen brought Edward Thomas's Ordnance Survey maps of Gloucestershire. Helen's prose divides beautifully into lines. The words are Helen's, but mysteriously, the poem is mine. I feel superstitious and suspicious saying that. A map of Gloucestershire after Helen Thomas. Ivor Gurney, excuse me, I'll take a sip. A map of Gloucestershire after Helen Thomas. Ivor Gurney at once spread it out on his bed, and he and I spent the whole time I was there, tracing with our fingers the lanes and byways and villages of which he knew every step, and over which Edward had walked. He spent that hour in revisiting his beloved home, in spotting a village or a track, a hill or a wood, and seeing it all in his mind's eye, a mental vision sharper and more actual for his heightened intensity. He trod in a way we who were sane could not emulate. The lanes and fields he knew and loved so well, his guide being his finger tracing the way on the map. It was most deeply moving, and I knew that I had hit on an idea that gave him more pleasure than anything else I could have thought of. For he had Edward as his companion in this strange perambulation.
Michael, thank you. That was incredible. So memorable and beautiful. Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our program of readers. I did say that people could send their comments in through the chat function. We've got lots of lovely comments. We have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Michael Joseph, great to see you, Michael, from the States. Loving these readings so much. So glad I could eavesdrop on such beauty. One that says, that was gorgeous. I think, Edna, that was you on Edward Thomas. In terms of questions, Tim, there's a couple of questions about a little bit more about Ivor Gurney. If you just sort of, because you were, the connection from rural Devon was a little bit shaky at times. And so people have asked, if you'd say a little bit more about Ive Gurney.
Wow, where do I start? Well, as you'll have gathered from the poems, he's and from Michael's poem that he just read, actually, he was a man of Gloucestershire. He grew up in Gloucester, and so he was in the Gloucestershire Regiment in the war. He started off as a composer, and actually, although he did carry on composing songs during the war, it was tricky without a piano, and so he started writing poetry as well. And after the war, he had suffered from mental health issues actually before the war as well. It wasn't that the war, no doubt he did have PTSD, but he had other underlying issues, and but was writing prolifically music and poetry in the years after the war. He was committed to an asylum in 1922 and he never came out. He died in 1937. And there's just so much material because there was no one kind of cheering for him, helping him. He would do nothing but write and compose all day. So there's masses of material. It's very hit and miss, but the great stuff really is great. Thank you.
The sort of one other direct question we've got is an interesting one. I have to say, I don't think I know the answer, but we've got a lot of experts here, which is when John Wilkins asked, when would they have taught war poetry or read war poetry in schools after 1918? I'm sort of looking at Tim, but does anybody else want to volunteer for that? Certainly by the time I was in school in the 1970s, it was a big part of the curriculum.
I can leap in because
I
think
thanks, Fran.
it comes, Tim might disagree, but I think it comes from teaching it in schools, comes from the two big anthologies that came out in the 50th anniversary, so Men Who March Away and Up the Line to Death, and that determined the way it was taught in schools. So by the time those filter into the curricula, it probably is the 1970s. And I taught it very much that way in the 1980s as well in school, that this was a male First World War trench lyric phenomenon. Of course, that's changed massively since then. I teach Tim's anthology now, so I will say no more on that point.
Oh, that's very good. That was my guess. And certainly in the 70s at my school, it was John Silkin's Penguin anthology that we did. And as I said earlier, that was, I guess that was in the context of the Cold War as well. And the sense that these were poems for peace and poems against war. That was certainly what would get you a good mark in your essay if you said that. But anybody else want to add anything to that? If not, people are starting to leave. Here we go. Somebody says, Jonathan Allison says, we read Men Who March Away at Foyle College 1969-70. There you are. So it's exactly good. And lots of people writing very nice things now. Thank you for all the wonderful poems. Bel, loved your readings of A Nurse, and as always, Michael, so amazing to hear you read. So many thanks. And people say a very emotional experience to hear, and a splendid evening. Thank you so much. So I think we're going to call an end to it there. There's too many messages, but we can put those out. It was lovely to have everybody here. I know we were not able to meet, but I think seeing each other here is possibly the next best thing. And while we wait to be allowed to see each other once again, and I can't wait for that. And I think we should plan all sorts of parties once we're allowed out again. If you are not a member of the War Poets Association, do think about joining. Go to www.warpoets.org. You, among other things, you'll get this the lovely war poetry review, picture of Robert Graves on the front of this one, and you will find out more about the next poetry tour that Andy is organizing. I'm going to sign off by thanking all of our wonderful speakers, Michael and Edna Longley, Steve Douglas, Fran Brearton, Tim, Kendall, Antony Owen, Santanu and Bel Mooney, all brought such an interesting, as I thought they would, a really interesting collection of poets and poems. And I think that worked really well, allowing our readers just to choose what they wanted to choose and to bring those poems with them. It was great. I'm very happy to leave the room open because I struggled at the beginning to get any sense of control because people were unmuting themselves, catching up with old friends. Why not use this as a chance to say hello to people? So I shall leave it open, but formally I'm going to now say thank you all very much for coming, and I'm looking to experts like Charles to say, Charles, can you unmute everybody?
Wow, that's a good question.
No, I don't.
I can't. I can ask everyone to unmute.
Yes. Ask all to unmute. I've done that. Yeah. And so whoever wishes to hang around in the Zoom room and chat, we're going to say formally thanks very much for coming and have a very good evening. But good to see everybody, and stay here and chat if you want to.
Thank you, Paul.
Brilliant, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.